Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really glad you're here because today's topic is, well, it's a bit wild.
Quite literally wild, yeah.
Exactly. So, in Denmark recently, a forest ranger was actually taken to court, like facing criminal charges for animal neglect.
Which is pretty intense for a forest ranger.
Right. And his alleged crime was letting this herd of, I think it was 76 cattle, just live completely outside during a really harsh winter.
Yeah, 76. But the kicker here is he wasn't running some, commercial dairy farm. He was managing this major environmental initiative.
Molsbjerg's Rewilding project, right?
Exactly. And he was using those cattle not as livestock, but basically as, ecosystem managers.
Which completely shreds that postcard perfect view of nature we all have. We're looking at a story today that trades that serene image in for a landscape that is, frankly, incredibly messy, highly political, and, anything but serene.
That trial is just the perfect entry point into this whole narrative because it highlights this massive philosophical divide over there.
Okay, let's unpack this because Denmark is basically split right down the middle when it comes to land use.
Right. Completely. On one hand, you have this highly specialized, incredibly efficient industrial agriculture, like an industry built on absolute total control of the land.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have these new tiny pockets of wild nature, places like Molsbjerg, where they're trying to relinquish control entirely, just step back and let it be.
And so the central question of that trial was, are these cattle farm animals that need humans to shelter and feed them, or are they wild animals just surviving on their own terms inside a fenced ecosystem?
Exactly. And, the courts ultimately acquitted the ranger.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. But the fact that it even went to a full criminal trial shows just how deeply uncomfortable modern society is with nature not being perfectly controlled.
Oh, 100%. Like, we love the idea of returning to nature, but as we get into today's sources, this really layered narrative from Denmark, often called the Gotham story, there's this distinct sarcasm about it all.
It's so true. It's like we fundamentally expect the wilderness to come with, a part-time janitor and maybe a complimentary leaf blower.
Yes. We want wild, but we want it tidy. Which brings us to the core of our mission today, exploring this messy reality of growing wild and rewilding management.
And we get to see this through the eyes of two students, Kesser and Steen, and their nature and innovation teacher, Professor Hendricks.
Yeah, so Professor Hendricks takes the class on this field trip to Gribskov Forest to witness modern forest management firsthand.
Which is great because it grounds these massive, kind of abstract global environmental debates right in the mud of a local community.
Literally in the mud.
Yeah.
So they focus on two main drivers of rewilding out there: grazing and hydrology.
Right. And if we start with the grazing part, it's not just about, putting animals in a field to eat.
No, introducing year-round grazing with horses, cows, bison. They're fundamentally terraforming the landscape.
They really are. And the narrative highlights this very specific and slightly gross biological mechanism with the horses.
Oh, the latrines. Yes, so horses designate these specific areas to do their business, and it creates these highly localized, incredibly nutrient-rich microhabitats.
Yeah. But it's not just the nutrients doing the work, right? It's the physical trampling.
Exactly. We're talking about massive animals churning up the soil with their hooves.
Yeah.
And this literally wakes up dormant seed banks in the dirt.
Seeds that haven't sprouted in, decades?
Decades. You end up with these rare plants sprouting that haven't seen the sun in 50 years, all because a horse, churned the dirt at exactly the right time and broke through that dense top layer of grass.
It's amazing. And that core theme of undoing human interference brings us right to the hydrology piece.
The drainage ditches.
Right. For generations, humans have been digging these extensive drainage ditches through forests. The goal was always to dry out the soil.
Make it nice and neat for straight rows of timber or to expand farmland.
Exactly. But in Gribskov, the rewilding teams are actually going in with heavy machinery and actively filling those old drainage ditches back in.
They were literally reversing the human plumbing. And when you stop that drainage, the natural water fluctuations return.
The forest floor gets waterlogged again?
Right. You bring back the bogs, the alder swamps.
Yeah.
And the biological response is immediate. Like the moment the water returns, there's this explosive boom in insects.
Dragonflies mostly, right?
Huge booms in dragonflies,
Yeah.
which brings in the amphibians, which then brings in the birds that feed on them. It's this whole chain reaction triggered just by letting the water sit where it wants to.
It's so cool. And there's another intervention they do in Gribskov that the class sees called veteranization.
Oh man, this part blew my mind.
It deals with the life cycle or the succession of a natural forest, because a truly wild forest has a distinct breakdown phase.
Right. Old trees die, they rot, woodpeckers hollow them out, and eventually they fall over.
Exactly. And that opens up the canopy so sunlight hits the forest floor and you get new saplings,
Yeah.
the rejuvenation phase.
But because these were historically production forests, designed purely to grow timber for us humans, they never reached that old rotting stage. Like, the trees were harvested while they were still perfectly healthy and solid.
They never got the chance to get old.
Wait, so this whole veterinization process, are we basically doing the equivalent of buying pre-distressed, ripped jeans, but for trees?
That is actually a remarkably accurate way to look at it. Yeah, we completely robbed the forest of its senior citizens.
Wow.
A production forest completely lacks those final life stages of maturation and breakdown. And there are thousands of species, like specific fungi, rare beetles, bats, certain birds, that absolutely depend on rotting wood and hollow trunks to survive.
So without old trees, those species just vanish.
They're gone. So to fix this, foresters actively go in and intentionally damage healthy trees to fake old age.
Taking chainsaws to healthy trees.
Yeah. They use chainsaws to carve artificial hollows, or they intentionally introduce specific types of fungal rot. They're basically fast-tracking the aging process, so endangered species don't have to wait 200 years for a habitat.
That's incredible.
In a wild forest, dead wood isn't trash to be cleaned up. It's biological gold. It's the absolute foundation of the food web.
Fungi break down the wood, insects eat the fungi, birds eat the insects.
Exactly. But getting people to understand that a rotting, dying tree is actually a sign of a thriving ecosystem, that's a massive uphill battle.
Oh, for sure. And, it's easy to look at foresters chaining up dead wood and think, oh, well, that's a remote national park issue.
Right, out in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the exact same biological friction, this intense hatred of messy nature, plays out right in Kesser and Steen's own suburban backyards.
Yeah, after the field trip, the classroom discussion shifts to their own neighborhood, and they realize they have this textbook landscape mosaic right behind their houses.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What exactly is a landscape mosaic?
It just means a patchwork of different types of habitats situated right next to each other. And biologically, the setup these students have is basically a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's 3 distinct zones, right? First, they have this crystal clear pond,
Right. And right next to that is a 50-year-old abandoned allotment garden.
which is protected by law.
Yes, under Danish law, this specific patch is a protected Section 25 forest. That means it's recognized for its high natural value and cannot simply be cleared or developed. It's full of those old, hollow, rotting trees we were just talking about in Gripskov.
And then, right next to that protected patch, is a 20-year-old overgrown field that was just left to its own devices.
It's a crazy combination. The different zones support wildly different stages of life, but they completely rely on each other.
Like the great crested newts. The narrative details how they need the clear, sunlit water of the pond to breed.
But they also need the damp, rotting logs of that abandoned garden to hide under during the day.
Exactly. And those old trees in the Section 25 area are also crucial for bats. There are 4 different species of bats utilizing the deep hollows in those trees for frost-free winter hibernation.
And we can't forget the sand lizards.
Oh, the lizards. They're probably the most fragile residents out there on the overgrown field.
Yeah, they specifically seek out the sun-baked, windswept sandy hills in that field. They absolutely require that direct, intense heat radiating off the exposed sand to incubate their eggs underground.
It's such a delicate, interconnected web. Like if the trees in the garden grow too dense, they block the sun from the sandy hills, and the lizard's eggs won't hatch.
And if the water quality in the pond drops, the newts lose their breeding ground.
Right, and the narrative really frames this as a deeply frustrating dynamic for the students, because this delicate balance is constantly threatened by people who, ironically, claim to love nature.
The wealthy city dwellers.
Yes. They decide they want to escape the urban grind, so they move out to this suburban edge, specifically for the nature view.
And the students observe what happens next, and it's basically the great tragicomedy of modern suburban expansion.
It really is.
The newcomers treat this incredibly delicate landscape mosaic like an extension of their manicured lawns. Or worse, like their personal dumping ground.
They take all their grass clippings, their heavy hedge trimmings, all their garden waste, and they just toss it straight into or right next to that pristine, crystal clear pond.
Which is devastating.
I really want to break down the actual chemistry of why this is so destructive here, because most people just think of grass clippings as, natural.
It's just plants, right?
But dumping massive amounts of garden waste into a balanced pond is essentially dropping a nitrogen bomb on the ecosystem.
It acts like a massive, highly concentrated dose of fertilizer.
Exactly. Because the pond water is naturally low in nutrients, which is what keeps the water clear. So when you introduce all that nitrogen and phosphorus from the decomposing grass,
The algae in the pond just explodes.
a massive bloom. The algae covers the entire surface, completely blocking out the sunlight. And when that huge amount of algae eventually dies and starts to decompose, the bacteria breaking it down consume almost all the oxygen in the water.
Suffocating everything else.
Yes. The submerged plants that the amphibians rely on to attach their eggs die off from lack of light and oxygen.
And in practically no time at all, this clear, thriving ecosystem is transformed into a dark, bottomless, suffocating mud soup where nothing but the most basic bacteria can survive.
It's so sad. But the story paints this as a profound Disneyfication of nature. The new residents genuinely seem to treat the wilderness like a theme park.
You want the beautiful view without any of the messy reality of biological cycles.
They just assume that because they pay high property taxes, the local municipality must employ some sort of magical nature janitor who, comes in quietly at night to clean up the wilderness and balance the water chemistry.
And Professor Hendricks uses this incredibly vivid, deeply sarcastic metaphor in the classroom to illustrate just how absurd this mentality is.
Oh, the swamp creature. I loved this part.
He tells the students to imagine that deep down in the muck of the pond, there is a green, scaly swamp creature standing in the pouring rain. He's wearing a tool belt, holding a rake, and he has this magical key ring.
Wait, and on this key ring is something called a bog pipe cleaner, right?
Yeah, a moose piberensatang in Danish. It basically looks like a giant magical metal corkscrew.
Because the city folks keep dumping their grass clippings and creating these thick, impenetrable plugs of rot and nitrogen, this imaginary swamp creature has to use his magical corkscrew to deep clean the mud out of the secret pipes leading all the way down to the Midgard Serpent's tunnel.
Just to keep the pond from overflowing with sludge.
It's hilarious, but it really highlights a grim reality using humor. People really act as though there's a hidden industrial mechanism, a swamp creature with a pipe cleaner, that will just automatically process their pollution.
But there isn't. When you dump concentrated nitrogen into a small pond, the pond simply dies. There is no magical reset button.
Which naturally leads Kesser and Steen to ask the obvious question. If this pond is connected to the town's drinking water aquifer, and strictly protected species like bats and newts are actively dying, why doesn't the local government just step in?
Right. Why not issue heavy fines?
Why don't they stop the bulldozers from clearing the Section 25 forest and fine the homeowners for dumping?
And this is where the classroom discussion transitions from ecology to sociology. The narrative outlines what it describes as a closed boys' club at the local political level.
It's all about misaligned incentives.
Entirely. Take the local newspaper, for instance. A journalist might really want to launch a hard-hitting investigation into the ecological destruction, but the paper relies heavily on the municipality and local real estate developers buying advertising space just to keep the lights on.
So the local press is completely financially compromised.
Yeah, and the story points out that environmental experts are often caught in the exact same trap. Environmental consulting firms might conduct surveys of the area, but they often won't speak up too loudly or push for strict enforcement.
Because they're competing to win the next lucrative consulting contract from that very same municipality.
Exactly. And the local politicians, well, they have their own metrics for success. Their primary goal is usually attracting new taxpayers to fund the municipal budget.
Build new infrastructure, get reelected.
So protecting a small population of sand lizards or preserving a rotting patch of woods, that usually takes a back seat to approving a lucrative new subdivision.
For the locals who actually care, the students describe the feeling as being like Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill. Every single time Kesser, Steen, and their neighbors get some traction, gather evidence, and present it to the town hall, the stone rolls right back down over them.
A variance is granted, a blind eye is turned.
And another piece of the habitat is crushed. It's infuriating.
It is, but what's fascinating here is that the narrative reveals an ultimate trump card that completely short-circuits this local political machinery.
Yes, the EU.
Professor Hendricks introduces the class to Annex 4 of the EU Habitats Directive.
Okay, let's define what Annex 4 actually means, because, it doesn't sound like something that would make a local mayor shake in their boots.
Fair enough. Annex 4 is a specific list of animal and plant species that require strict protection across the entire European Union.
So we're talking about the great crested newts, the sand lizards, the bat species.
Yes. Being on Annex 4 means their resting and breeding sites are protected by hard, binding international law.
Wow.
It is not a gentle suggestion from a nature charity, and it is not a local zoning ordinance that a town council can just, wave away to do a favor for a developer friend.
But how does a regular citizen actually wield international law against their neighbor's lawn clippings or a local bulldozer?
They use it through the National Appeals Board, known in Denmark as the Klagenævnet. And the strategy outlined in the story is incredibly actionable.
Because the local authorities might ghost you.
Exactly. But the National Appeals Board operates entirely outside that local ecosystem of favors. They do not care who is eating canapés with the mayor at the summer gala.
They don't care about the local newspaper's ad revenue.
Not at all. They operate on a strict binary evaluation of biological facts.
Are there Annex 4 species present? Yes.
Yes.
Is the proposed development or the current activity harming their breeding or resting habitat? Yes. Boom.
Boom. The local municipal decision is completely overturned from the top down.
That is so powerful. And the characters in the story also start getting smarter about bypassing the local media gatekeepers entirely, right?
Yeah, if the local paper won't print the story about the illegal dumping because of ad revenue, the citizens don't just wait around.
They take high-definition photos of the clear water and side-by-side photos of the toxic mud soup.
They even record the specific echolocation sounds of the 4 bat species using cheap detectors.
And they post all of that hard, irrefutable data directly onto local community Facebook groups, like publicly shaming the politicians right in front of their voters.
Ensuring the biological facts can't just be buried in some filing cabinet at town hall.
Sometimes, the neighbors just skip the bureaucracy entirely and confront the newcomers directly in their driveways, just armed with the biological facts about exactly what those grass clippings are doing to the protected salamanders.
You really have to be loud and you have to be stubborn. And this tension perfectly sets up the climax of the classroom narrative.
This is where Professor Hendricks drops a massive bomb on the students.
Yeah, he stands at the front of the class and drops a piece of news that fundamentally shifts the power dynamic.
The EU has just announced they want to listen directly to citizens about their experiences on the ground.
They're opening a direct channel. They're asking to hear exactly how rules regarding Natura 2000 and Section 3 areas are being handled locally.
Just to put that in context, Natura 2000 is a massive network of core breeding and resting sites for rare and threatened species across the EU.
Right. And Section 3 areas are a Danish legal classification protecting specific vulnerable nature types like bogs, heaths, and ancient meadows.
So the EU wants to know if these strict international and national protections are being completely ignored by local authorities. They want citizens to tell them about the caterpillar bulldozers rolling over protected lands, acting as if everything green on a map is just an empty lawn waiting to be paved over with concrete.
And the story describes Steen's reaction so vividly. When he hears that Brussels wants to hear from people like him, his jaw practically hits the floor with a thud. Like it's described like an earthquake hitting the village.
He's stunned, because it means someone with actual power is finally holding the clipboard and taking notes.
Exactly. And Professor Hendricks points out the profound implication of this direct outreach. This isn't just like a polite listening tour.
No, it is a glaringly clear, flashing red signal to the incoming Danish government and to all those local municipalities.
It tells local zoning boards, hey, these environmental regulations were not created by accident. They're not optional guidelines.
We know there is a systemic issue with local enforcement looking the other way, and the higher-ups are now watching this local corruption very, very closely.
It validates all that exhausting Sisyphus-style rock rolling the citizens have been doing. It tells them that their data collection, their photos of mud soups, their recordings of bats, it all actually matters on a continental scale.
Because you can't hide behind a compromised local newspaper or a friendly environmental consultant when the European Union is setting up a direct hotline to ask your citizens what is really going on in their backyards.
It's a total game changer.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. I mean, we started in the messy, deliberate creation of rot and dead wood in Gribskov's Rewilding project, looking at how bringing back hydrology and large grazers creates life by undoing human control.
And then we moved into the classroom discussion about the Disneyfication of local ponds by suburbanites who, expect a nature janitor to clean up their nitrogen bombs.
And we finished with the overarching power of international laws, specifically Annex C of the Habitats Directive, stepping in to break up local political monopolies, empowering citizens to bypass corrupt local systems.
Taking their fight straight to the top. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the takeaway from this Danish narrative is really clear. Real nature isn't a manicured park.
It isn't a static postcard.
Right. It requires active, sometimes highly confrontational protection. It requires a high tolerance for dead wood, for mud, and for complex natural cycles that don't look neat to the human eye.
And sometimes its survival completely depends on a group of loud, stubborn neighbors armed with biological facts and a smartphone who are just willing to make a fuss.
Exactly.
We demand so much accommodation from the natural world. We expect it to absorb our garden waste, our concrete, our noise, and just magically bounce back with the help of a swamp creature and a pipe cleaner.
But imagine if the roles were reversed.
Right. If nature had to adapt to human bureaucracy the way we expect it to adapt to our pollution, would the wildlife eventually just learn to file their own zoning complaints?
That's a wild thought.
Next time you are walking and you see a seemingly messy patch of woods, ask yourself, is it actually messy? Or is it just operating on a biological schedule that we humans are far too impatient to understand? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.